Trump called security to kick Jasmine Crockett out, but before they reached her, she stood up and spoke. What she said stunned everyone. And the ending. Even Trump didn't see it coming. Don't blink. Jasmine Crockett had faced hostile rooms before, committee hearings where her mic had been cut, town halls where the crowd was planted to heckle, cable news panels where the goal wasn't dialogue, it was demolition. But this was different. This wasn't just another Republican venue. This was Mar-a-Lago, and she was walking in completely alone. The marble floors beneath her echoed each step with a hollow confidence she didn't fully feel. Every hallway guard watched her like she didn't belong. Their stares weren't overt, but they lingered just enough to say, "Why is she here?" Even the staff, well-dressed and overly polite, avoided eye contact as they passed. It was clear they hadn't been briefed for a guest like her. The air inside was unusually thick for Florida, too still, as if the walls themselves were waiting to react. Her team had begged her not to come. "It's a trap," one aide said. "They'll spin it, mock it, edit you into something you're not." But Jasmine had seen the invitation. Hand-delivered, no signature, just an embossed card and a single line of typed text. Closed-door policy summit, invitation extended to Representative Jasmine Crockett. At first she laughed, then she read it again. A Republican summit, hosted by Trump himself, and she, the only Democrat invited? She was half convinced it was a prank, but something in her gut said otherwise. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the part of her that believes showing up in places where you're unwanted matters more than shouting in rooms where everyone agrees. Now she was here, walking into a room packed with power and silence. There were no cameras, no media, no flashing lights. This wasn't a press stunt. This was something private. A long conference table stretched across the room like a chessboard, occupied by top-level Republican operatives, ex-administration officials, corporate donors, and elected leaders. Some she recognized. Others she only knew from headlines and not the flattering ones. The moment she stepped in, the conversation halted. No one said a word. One man, she recognized him as a Texas oil executive, raised an eyebrow, clearly stunned. Another whispered something into a colleague's ear, who immediately turned to glare at her. She wasn't wearing anything outlandish. No flashy colors, just a sharp dark navy suit and a soft gold pin of the Constitution on her lapel. Still, she stood out like a spotlight in a blackout. Jasmine nodded politely. No smiles returned. She moved toward the only open seat near the end of the table. Everyone else was already seated. It was clear her chair had been placed intentionally, isolated. She was being positioned, literally at the edge of power. No one welcomed her. No one offered a handshake. She placed her phone face down on the table, adjusted her posture, and waited. If they wanted her nervous, they were going to be disappointed. She'd come this far. She wasn't shrinking now. A door opened near the front of the room. Conversation stirred slightly and then stopped again. He had arrived. Donald Trump entered the room like he always did, owning it before he even spoke. His trademark red tie hung just a bit too long. His walk was deliberate, slow, and practiced. He didn't look at Jasmine. Not once. But he saw her. His eyes flicked past her like she was a painting on a wall. He took his seat at the head of the table, cleared his throat, and leaned forward. "Let's begin." And with those two words, the temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Jasmine folded her hands quietly in front of her. Every muscle in her body was alert. They didn't invite her to speak. They didn't invite her to listen. They invited her to witness something, maybe even to be used as a prop. But she wasn't here to play a role. She was here to disrupt one. The silence didn't go away, it simply changed form. It became whispers behind still lips, glances disguised as curiosity, and tension so thick it pulsed against the walls. Jasmine Crockett sat still, spine straight, hands clasped, face unreadable. She could feel the eyes. Some stared openly, others stole quick looks as if afraid she'd notice. But she noticed. She noticed everything. To her right sat a man she recognized from countless Senate hearings. He had once tried to defund the education grants she fought hard to secure. He now stared at his tablet, pretending to be too busy to acknowledge her presence. Across the table, a woman in a crimson pantsuit leaned toward a colleague and whispered behind a thinly veiled smirk. Jasmine caught the word token, and the smirk widened. Still, she didn't react. She didn't need to. Not yet. The room was full of polished power, old money, old politics, and older grudges. But beneath the surface, there was something more corrosive. Discomfort. Not fear, not anger. Just the unbearable presence of someone they didn't expect to have to face in person. They were comfortable when she was a face on cable news or a soundbite they could mock on social media. But in person, unapologetically present, confident, and unwilling to shrink, she was something else entirely. She didn't fit their frame. Trump sat at the head, posture casual, flipping through a folder like he already knew what was inside. His face showed no acknowledgement of her. It was as if her chair were empty. A man 2 seats down from him, one of Trump's longtime donors, cleared his throat and asked a question about border enforcement. The conversation picked up slightly. Numbers, bills, proposals. It was policy talk, the kind that sounds impressive but rarely says anything real. Jasmine watched as people nodded along to their ideas, applauding themselves in subtle ways. Still, no one asked her anything. She wasn't meant to contribute. She was meant to sit and watch, maybe speak once or twice, and then quietly fade into the background. The room didn't fear confrontation. They feared being questioned. They feared disruption, and she was disruption made flesh. Then came the moment, the first real crack in the wall. A former cabinet member, clearly annoyed by Jasmine's unspoken presence, decided to speak plainly. "Well," he said, looking directly at her for the first time since she arrived, "since we have bipartisan representation in the room, perhaps our guest would care to share how the progressive wing plans to fund this fantasy of open borders." It was venom masked as politeness, the kind of line designed not for a real answer, but for laughs. A few chuckles broke out around the table. Jasmine didn't smile. She leaned forward slightly and said nothing. Her silence made the air feel heavier than any comeback ever could. The man raised his brows as if to say, "Nothing? No fight?" Then Trump chuckled, not loudly, not harshly, just enough to make it clear whose side he was on. "That's okay," he said without even turning her way. "Some guests just enjoy the view." Laughter followed. Short, smug, rehearsed laughter. It bounced around the room like static. Jasmine looked down at her hands for just a second, not out of shame, but calculation. She knew what this was. She knew exactly what kind of room she'd walked into. A room full of men who thought power was measured by who gets to speak and who gets to sit quietly in the corner. But Jasmine hadn't come to sit quietly. Not now, not ever. She straightened her shoulders, looked around slowly, and locked eyes with every single person who had just laughed. One by one, the smiles faded, and just when it seemed like the moment had passed, Trump leaned back in his chair, lifted a hand like he was brushing away an insect, and said flatly, "Let's move on." Then he turned slightly and muttered to someone next to him, not quietly enough, "Should have had a security check on that invite list." The words weren't a joke, and Jasmine knew exactly what was coming next. Trump didn't need to raise his voice. He never did when he wanted to humiliate someone. He had mastered the art of making someone feel small with casual cruelty. His tone was light, his facial expressionless, but the meaning behind his words was unmistakable. Should have had a security check on that invite list. There it was. No laughter this time, just silence, the kind that creeps down your spine and settles in your stomach. Jasmine didn't flinch, but inside, her blood boiled. He hadn't looked at her when he said it. He didn't need to. The room knew exactly who he meant, and worse, they agreed. No one objected. No one said, "Hey, that's not okay." Instead, there was a collective tension that seemed to say, "Let's see what happens next." She looked around the table. Their faces were masks, practiced indifference, feigned professionalism, hidden smugness. Some were waiting for her to react. Others hoped she wouldn't. But they all shared one thought. She doesn't belong here. Trump returned to his briefing folder, tapping a page with his finger. "Now, back to the matter of those federal oversight waivers. he said, directing his attention to the man on his left. We've got governors calling me every day about this nonsense. Total waste, useless regulation. But no one was listening anymore. Not really, because in that moment, every eye in the room flicked toward Jasmine again. The air had changed. Trump's comment had opened a door, and now everyone was waiting to see whether he'd walk through it all the way. He closed the folder and looked toward one of the agents near the entrance. Not a word spoken, just a small nod. That was all it took. The agent began moving. He wasn't aggressive, he didn't rush, but he walked with certainty, deliberate, like this had been discussed, planned, approved. The room grew colder. Someone coughed nervously. A chair creaked. A woman near the middle shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Jasmine could hear it all, every breath in that room. And still, Trump never looked at her. She could feel the eyes of the room flickering between her and the security guard, now walking directly toward her seat. It was the longest 20 feet in political history. Every second stretched. 10 steps. 5. 2. Then, Jasmine stood, slowly, without drama, without panic. She didn't fumble with her bag. She didn't speak. She simply rose and turned to face the man approaching her. She looked him in the eyes, not with fear, not with defiance, but with something far more unnerving. Calm. And then she turned to the table, to the smirking faces, the smothered grins, the polite expressions concealing venom, to Trump. Only now did he look up, and in that exact second, Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it hit the room like a gavel. Before you send me out, she said, her tone measured, you should at least hear why I came. It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration. And suddenly, no one in that room was breathing. The room locked into a frozen stillness, as if Jasmine's voice had pressed an invisible pause button on every moving part. The security guard stopped mid-step, unsure now. He looked at Trump for further instruction, hand resting near his belt, not threatening, but ready. Jasmine didn't wait for permission. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her voice didn't tremble. She stood there, tall, still, centered, with a kind of presence that couldn't be trained or taught. She wasn't defying authority. She was embodying it. I came here, she said, because someone in this room thought enough of the American people to include a voice that didn't echo their own. Her gaze swept the table slowly. No one interrupted her, not even Trump. I didn't come to argue. I didn't come to perform. I came because I believe something is still worth saving. A man at the far end scoffed under his breath, but no one joined him. Not this time. Jasmine took one step forward, not toward the exit, but toward the heart of the room. The security guard instinctively moved to block her path. She stopped, held up a hand gently as if to say, I'm not going anywhere yet. And then she looked directly at Trump. I've disagreed with nearly everything you've stood for. I've opposed your policies, your rhetoric, and your decisions. But I never stopped believing that people like me should still be allowed in rooms like this. Trump tilted his head slightly, arms folded, unreadable. But for the first time, his smirk was gone. You called security, she continued, because you thought I came here to make a scene. You thought I came to embarrass you. But what's embarrassing is the way this room reacted before I even opened my mouth. A few eyes lowered. One man rubbed his temple. You treat disagreement like a disease. You treat opposition like betrayal. And you treat the American people like spectators to a show you believe only you deserve to direct. Now her voice began to rise, not shouting, not angry, but steady and unrelenting, like a tide. I wasn't invited to speak. I wasn't expected to speak, but I have to speak because this isn't just about me. This is about every single person who's been made to feel invisible in their own country. She took another step. The guard didn't move this time. I represent more than a district. I represent the kid in Alabama whose school roof is caving in. I represent the nurse in Ohio who had to ration insulin. I represent the black farmers in Georgia denied loans again and again. I represent the woman in Iowa who sends her kids to bed with empty stomachs and turns on the TV only to see politicians laughing about how great the economy is. Someone at the table tried to interject, a soft, "Okay, we've heard enough." But Jasmine raised a single hand. "No," she said firmly. "You haven't heard anything." That silenced the voice instantly. Then slowly, Jasmine reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. She didn't read it. She just held it up. "This is a letter from a woman named Teresa Campbell. You've never heard of her. She's not a donor. She's not a lobbyist. She's not on anyone's Christmas card list. She's just a mother in Mississippi who lost her job, then her insurance, then her son to a disease that could have been treated. If anyone had listened, if anyone had cared." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "She voted for you once," she said, eyes locking with Trump's again. "She believed you when you said you were going to drain the swamp. She believed you when you said you cared about the forgotten." She held the letter higher. "And she asked me to bring this, to ask you one question. When did we stop listening to people like her?" The room was no longer still. It was stunned. No one moved. No one whispered. Even Trump said nothing. Jasmine lowered the letter slowly, folded it back into her pocket, and then stepped backward, deliberately. "You don't have to like me. You don't have to agree with me. But if you're going to pretend this country still belongs to the people, then you damn well better be willing to hear from you all of them." She glanced toward the security guard. "I'll go," she said softly, "but not because you asked." She turned toward the door, and in that moment, the silence in the room wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she had just forced every one of them to hear. Jasmine hadn't made it 3 steps before the silence cracked. A single voice rang out from the middle of the table, measured, unsure, but distinct. "Let her finish." Heads turned. It was Senator Mark Rutledge, a staunch conservative known for his sharp tongue and uncompromising partisanship. His eyes weren't warm, but they weren't hostile either. They held something unexpected: respect. Trump turned slightly in his chair, eyebrows raised. Rutledge nodded once, almost like a challenge. "If we can't listen to a sitting member of Congress, what are we even pretending to do here?" No one responded. Trump's lips parted like he was about to dismiss the comment, but he stopped. He didn't nod. He didn't object. He simply leaned back in his chair and said, without emotion, "Go ahead." Just 2 words, but in this room they felt like bricks. Jasmine turned around slowly, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her, testing her, waiting to see if she would shrink now that the moment was hers. She didn't. She took a breath, just one. And then her voice returned, low, steady, intimate. No theatrics, no shouting, just quiet fire. "I came here knowing exactly how this room would feel," she said. "I knew the looks I'd get. I knew I wouldn't be welcomed. But what I didn't expect, what still shocks me, is how deeply afraid some of you are to hear from someone outside your circle." She walked a few feet back toward the table, hands still calm at her sides. "I'm not here to score points. I'm here because people are breaking in this country. They are screaming in silence while rooms like this argue over slogans. You talk about border security like it's a game, while border towns are being hollowed out and families are being torn apart. Yes, from immigration policy, but also poverty, opioids, homelessness, and despair." No one interrupted her. She glanced at a man in a navy blazer. He had mocked her earlier with the bipartisan fantasy comment. "I get that I make some of you uncomfortable. My presence doesn't fit the polished image you like to project. But what's uncomfortable is this: your comfort while others suffer. Your ability to smile and fundraise and make deals while the rest of the country bleeds beneath you." A woman near the front shifted in her chair, visibly moved. Jasmine didn't pause. "I read a poll this morning. Said 68% of Americans don't believe either party cares about them. Either. And they're right. Because when was the last time anyone in this room sat down with a coal worker whose lungs are collapsing? Or with a kid who's afraid to go to school because her backpack might not stop a bullet? When was the last time you even looked someone in the eyes who wasn't part of your network?" Her voice dipped lower, slower, heavier. "I sat with a man last month who lost his son to fentanyl. You know what he said to me? He said, 'They all come around during election season. Then they disappear. They shake my hand, then vanish with the cameras.'" She paused. I told him I wouldn't be like that. Her gaze swept the room again. I showed up here not to be liked, not to be agreed with, but because it matters, showing up where no one expects you to, standing in front of people who think they already know what you are, and proving them wrong. She took another step forward. There's not a person in this room who doesn't think they're fighting for the future. But ask yourself, whose future are you writing for? Now her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of truth. I'm tired of visiting classrooms with ceiling tiles falling in. I'm tired of consoling mothers who've lost their sons to police violence and mothers who've lost their sons in uniform because this country hasn't figured out how to care for its own. I'm tired of watching rural hospitals shut down while corporations get subsidies to build golf resorts. And then she stopped. Let the silence return. Only now it wasn't cold, it was heavy, necessary, earned. She looked back at the security guard. He hadn't moved an inch. She turned back to the table. I didn't come here to fight, she said. I came here because there's still a tiny part of me that believes someone in this room still gives a damn. And in that moment, no one dared say a word. Jasmine let the silence hang there, as if she were daring someone to break it. But no one did. Not this time. The room filled with hardened political veterans, billionaires, former governors, and senior advisors, people who had weathered scandals, hearings, wars, and elections, sat motionless, pinned in place by words they hadn't expected to hear and a presence they hadn't anticipated needing to respect. Then Jasmine reached slowly into the inside pocket of her blazer. I want to read you something, she said, her voice softer now, no longer pressing forward but pulling inward. It's not long, just one page. But I promise you, this is more honest than anything you'll find in the next 5 policy memos sitting in front of you. She unfolded the paper with care, as if it were sacred. I received this letter 3 weeks ago, she said, looking down at the ink-stained page. It came from a town you've probably never been to, Brookhaven, Mississippi. The population is just under 12,000. No Whole Foods, no cable news crews, just people. She took a breath and began to read. Dear Representative Crockett, I'm not one of your constituents and I'm not a Democrat. I'm writing to you because you were the only one who answered when I called. My name is Teresa Campbell. I'm 52 years old and I've lived in Mississippi my whole life. I worked at the same auto parts warehouse for 21 years until the plant shut down in 2020. I lost my job, my health insurance, everything. My son James was 17. He wanted to be a firefighter. He had asthma, but we couldn't afford the inhalers anymore. We were too proud to beg and too broke to survive. He died at home, in his sleep, because we had to make choices no parent should ever face. Jasmine paused. Her voice caught slightly and a few people looked away. Not out of boredom, but because the weight of what they were hearing felt unbearable. She continued, I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I believed him. He said he was going to fight for people like me, and maybe he meant it. Maybe they all mean it at first. But when the cameras are gone, when the rallies end, we're still here, forgotten. I'm not writing to ask for anything. It's too late for that. I'm writing to ask you, please don't stop caring. Don't stop fighting, even when they laugh at you, even when they ignore you. Jasmine folded the letter carefully and held it in her hand, like it was the most fragile object in the room. Her son was 17, she said. He died for no other reason than poverty. In America, in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. She didn't shout it, she whispered it, and that whisper echoed louder than anything else had so far. You can argue tax rates and border policy and gas prices all day, but when a kid dies because he couldn't afford a $30 inhaler, that's not politics. That's neglect. That's cruelty dressed up as fiscal responsibility. Jasmine looked up at them, at all of them. I brought this letter because Teresa didn't just want someone to blame. She wanted someone to listen. And if that's too much to ask, if a room full of powerful people can't even do that, then what exactly are we still doing here? She didn't wait for applause. She didn't expect sympathy. But she saw something shift. Shoulders slumped, brows furrowed. One man rubbed his wedding ring with his thumb. Another adjusted his glasses unnecessarily just to look away. And one of the women near the center, tight bun, red lipstick, steel eyes, blinked hard and looked down at her lap. Jasmine took one step back and laid the letter gently on the table in front of her. You can throw it away or you can read it again when the room empties and you're back to pretending this is all strategy and statistics. She straightened her blazer. I came here thinking I might get laughed out of the room. Instead, I got silence. And honestly, that might be worse, because silence means you heard me. Then she did something no one expected. She said nothing else. She just stood there, watching them sit in the mess of truth she had laid bare. No rebuttal, no protest, no outrage. Just the unbearable stillness of a room that could no longer pretend it hadn't been warned. Trump didn't speak right away. For the first time since Jasmine had walked into the room, he seemed to pause. Not caught off guard in the way someone's surprised by a clever jab or an unexpected question. It was deeper than that. He looked at the letter on the table as if it were a relic from a world he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Everyone else watched him, waiting for the performance to resume, waiting for the punchline or the put-down, the mockery, the pivot to dominance. But it didn't come. Not immediately. Jasmine stood silently, her face unreadable, eyes steady. She didn't try to push further. She had said what needed to be said, and now she gave him space to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the next few seconds. Trump finally tilted his head slightly and said, "You done?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't warm either. Just flat. Measured. Jasmine nodded once. "I am." He looked back down at the letter she had left on the table, but didn't reach for it. "You know, people like you." He stopped, rephrased. "You think speeches change things? That if you say something loud enough or sad enough, it'll move the needle?" Jasmine didn't reply. He looked up at her again. "But here's the thing. This room, we deal in reality, in power. Emotion doesn't build infrastructure. Tears don't lower gas prices." A few people nodded, relieved that their leader was regaining his footing. But then, something unusual. Trump gestured toward the paper again. "Still," he said, with something almost resembling contemplation, "that letter, it's real. I don't know that woman, but I've heard 1,000 stories like it." He looked at Jasmine again, more directly this time. "The problem is, people like that woman never show up in rooms like this. You do, I'll give you that." It wasn't praise. Not quite. But it wasn't dismissal either. "I didn't bring you here," he continued, voice lower now. "I didn't want you in this room, but you're here, and you said your piece. So I'll say mine." He uncrossed his arms. "I built a movement on the idea that people were tired of being ignored, forgotten, cheated by elites in suits who never looked them in the eye. Sound familiar?" He smirked slightly. Jasmine didn't blink. "But here's the truth. Washington didn't change me. I changed Washington. At least I made people listen. Doesn't mean they liked it." He gestured around the room, his voice picking up steam. "Half the people sitting here didn't believe in what I was doing at first. They didn't care about Mississippi or Ohio or West Virginia either. They cared about donors and think tanks. But they followed when they saw the crowd sizes. They followed when the message hit." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing now. "So if you want people like that woman in Mississippi to stop being forgotten, you want her voice heard?" He pointed a finger gently toward Jasmine. "Then stop preaching and start winning. Because if you don't hold power, nobody listens. And if you don't scare these people into listening, they'll keep stepping over folks like her for the rest of their lives." There it was. The core belief. Not compassion, not justice, but leverage. And Jasmine understood that. She nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I don't disagree," she said evenly, "but power that ignores pain is just cruelty in a nicer suit." Trump stared at her for a beat. Then without a word, he pushed his chair back from the table and stood. A few others immediately followed suit, unsure whether the meeting was over or if something more was about to unfold. He didn't signal to the security guard. He didn't wave her out. He just looked at her one last time. "You spoke," he said. Then he turned his back and walked toward the door. No applause, no final words. Just the quiet thud of expensive shoes on polished marble. Jasmine turned to the rest of the room. They didn't know whether to follow him or remain seated. She could feel their hesitation, the nervous shifting, the unsure glances. But something had cracked open. She had spoken. She had stood. She had stayed. And he hadn't stopped her. Jasmine didn't wait for anyone's approval. She didn't need it. As Trump exited the room, flanked by two aides and a wall of silence, Jasmine quietly gathered her things. She didn't rush. She didn't glance around to see who was watching. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who had come into hostile territory, said exactly what needed to be said, and now, without drama, was leaving on her terms. She picked up the folded letter from the table, then stopped. She looked at it for a moment, turned it in her hand, then placed it back down, gently, right in the center of the polished wood. A choice, a statement. Let them decide whether to read it again. Let them decide whether to pretend they hadn't been changed by it. She stepped away from her chair, heels echoing across the floor. Every step she took felt heavier, not from fear or doubt, but from the emotional weight of what she had just left behind in that room. She reached the double doors. Just before she could push them open, a voice came from behind her. It was quiet, hesitant, almost reluctant. "Congresswoman, wait." She turned slightly. It was Senator Rutledge again. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't grandstanding. He just looked tired. Honest. "I don't agree with you," he said. "On a lot. Probably on most things." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, silent. "But I heard you, and I can't stop thinking about that boy. The one who died in his sleep." The room was still. The others hadn't followed Trump out yet. Some were staring at the floor, some at Jasmine. Most just looked lost in thought. "She said he wanted to be a firefighter," Rutledge added. Jasmine nodded once. "James Campbell." "Right." He paused, then looked at the letter. "If it's okay, I'd like to keep that." She studied him for a beat, then gave the smallest, most solemn nod. He walked to the table, picked up the letter carefully, and folded it like something too sacred to crease. That's when it happened. A slow, tentative clap from the back. One pair of hands striking once, twice, then again. Jasmine turned toward the sound. It was one of the younger advisors. He looked barely 30. She didn't know his name, but his eyes were glassy, and his hands, though soft and uncertain, didn't stop clapping. Then another joined in, and another. Not loud, not performative, but real. A ripple of unexpected acknowledgement from a room that had planned to erase her presence the moment she walked in. The clapping didn't swell into thunder. It never got loud, but it spread just far enough to say, "Something happened here," and we saw it. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't bow. She just stood there, absorbing the moment. Then she turned and pushed the doors open. The hallway outside was quiet. Sunlight spilled across the marble. The air felt lighter, freer. She took one deep breath, like a release, and walked forward. One of Trump's staffers, a young woman with earbuds in and a clipboard hugged to her chest, stood against the far wall. She looked up as Jasmine passed and offered a small, respectful nod. Jasmine returned it. A staffer in a black suit near the elevator reached to press the button for her, but she was already moving, already outpacing everyone. The ride down was silent. No music, no chatter, just the quiet aftermath of something real. By the time she stepped outside, her phone was buzzing, multiple times. Dozens of notifications, texts, missed calls. Someone had leaked the footage. It was already online. The full exchange, her speech, the silence, even the moment she turned her back and walked away. And it was spreading. By nightfall, it would be everywhere. Clips would be dissected, headlines would scream, pundits would argue. But none of that mattered right now, because for once the story wasn't about who shouted the loudest, it was about who finally decided to listen.